everybody! So, welcome to Kitchen Chemistry, episode 3. My name is still Brianna, and I'm going to be your host again and forever. Yeah. So, last week, we kind of wrapped up our little thing. We'd been talking about dye molecules and anthocyanins, and we talked about pH and stuff like that. We were doing some real classic chemistry, which was awesome. Today, though, we are going to take a little bit of a right turn, and we're going to dip into the biochemistry area of cooking, because that is where I sort of hang out. I did a degree in microbiology. I just finished up, and basically, if you get a degree in microbiology, you just learn a ton about yeast, which is helpful because that's what we're going to talk about for the next 3 weeks or so, because we are going to start a project today that I am going to be carrying on with for the foreseeable future, because I think it's going to be fun. I've wanted to try it for a little while, and I think the science behind it is pretty darn cool. So this week, and for the foreseeable future, I have my jar out somewhere. Where's that bad boy? We're going to be talking about my little friend yeast. So, what is yeast? What's the scoop? Sometimes you add it to bread. It's in most bread. That's why bread rises. But it's in a lot of different baking goods. It's used in brewing. It's on your skin. It's on your fruit. It's in your body. It is everywhere. It's a hardy little single-celled microbe. It belongs to the family of funguses, so it's kind of related to mushrooms, which is a little wild. I don't think of this jar of stuff as mushrooms, but it's in the same family. Kingdom, technically. And it is a eukaryote. So before we get started, I'm going to do a lot of terminology today, because today is kind of the intro to all things yeast and all things bread going forward. So bear with me. I'm excited because this is what I've been studying for 4 years. So what is a eukaryote? A eukaryote cover most things like animal cells, plant cells. You're a bunch of eukaryotic cells, you watching this now, and funguses. So they are cells that have a nucleus. So a nucleus is kind of like the brain for the cell, and the word eukaryotic, like eukarya, actually means true kernel, I believe, in the Latin. So that kernel is what we call that nucleus. So it's where all the genetic information of a cell hangs out. So it has all the instructions for how to build the cell. So that covers all animal cells, plant cells, fungus, all of that kind of stuff. So again, your cat made of eukaryotic cells. You have a plant behind the camera made of eukaryotic cells. Me, eukaryotic cells. You, eukaryotic cells. Including our homeboy yeast. So on the flip side, other microbes, when we're thinking of microbiology, a lot of people think of things like bacteria. Bacteria are prokaryotes, so they don't have a nucleus. They're simpler cells. That's kind of how we call them, because they don't have a setup in organelles like our eukaryotic cells. But they're still really complicated. They're still very cool. And they're still capable of a lot of really dope stuff. So even though people are like, oh, they don't have a nucleus, they don't have a brain, they're still killing it. So prokaryotic cells, no nucleus, things like bacteria and archaea. And eukaryotic cells are animals, plants, and fungus. And if you're going, Brianna, what's a virus? It's none of those things. It's barely even alive. Maybe we'll talk about them way down the line, but they're not as relevant to cooking because they're just basically a bundle of DNA that takes over cells and does stuff with them. So, talking about yeast. Talked about it was a fungus. Talked about what a eukaryotic cell is. So these little cells do something called fermentation. So fermentation is where a cell gobbles up sugar. It loves that good sugar. Much like people, yeast loves sugar. It takes that sugar, and then as byproducts, it makes carbon dioxide, much like we do. When we produce energy for ourselves, we take in sugar and we spit out carbon dioxide literally out of our mouths while we breathe. But it also makes ethanol. So ethanol is an alcohol. It's a really basic alcohol, and it's why yeast is used for things like brewing. But it's also a protective measure of the yeast. The yeast doesn't make it just for fun. no cell really anywhere, if a cell or organism or anything is making a product, and it's especially if it's like a microbe and it's just making this product and excreting it, if it's not something like gas or something like that, like often these byproducts of their regular like biological processes, like what they do day to day, often have a purpose. Cells are very efficient and they don't just make junk for no reason. They're not like me where I'm bored, so I'm just gonna like bake cookies all day for funsies. Like they have a purpose, they gotta use their resources wisely, unlike me who uses chocolate chips like they grow on trees. So they use this ethanol actually to inhibit other cells in their environment. So yeasts are really tolerant to ethanol in general. And when I say yeast, sorry, I'm bouncing all over the place because I'm excited. When I say yeasts, it's kind of a broad term for a bunch of different types of cells that fall into this category. This is Saccharomyces cerevisiae, just the classic yeast used for bread. It's kind of everywhere. There's lots of different strains of it, but there's lots of different types of yeast. Like there's Candida yeast, which sometimes grows too much in your body and you have a bad time. Lots of different kinds of yeast. But producing ethanol actually kills off other cells besides the yeast cells that might be competing with the yeast for resources. So instead of just like growing and sharing resources, cells are big on sharing. They basically want the most nutrients, they want the most stuff so that they can reproduce the most. So they're not about to share with other critters around them. So by producing this ethanol, they actually kill off other cells around them, unless they're ethanol tolerant, so that they can use all their resources. And we, as human beings, good old Homo sapiens, taking the world by storm and breaking everything for our own survival and enjoyment, we have been taking advantage of this for thousands of years. They think bread, first, like yeasted bread, first originated in like early Egypt. So I'm talking like 2,000 years, 2000 BC, like 4,000 years ago. It's been a long time that we have been using yeast and bread. But if I am an Egyptian 2,000 years ago, can I just go and like mosey on to the store? I'm wearing my like linen outfit. I shaved my head and I'm wearing a wig because that was very trendy in ancient Egypt. And you know, we gotta be trendy. I don't just go to like ye old Egyptian grocery store and buy a jar of yeast. That is not how this worked. So they actually took advantage of the yeast in their environment. They had no idea what it was, but they knew that if they fermented flour and water or fermented grain or fermented fruit, some sort of plant-based stuff, that eventually would make gas, would get bubbly, and it would make things taste good, or it would make alcohol. We're not talking about the alcohol anymore. So that is how we make things like sourdough bread. I'm going to get to that in a minute. First, we are going to do a little bit of experiment. It's a nice, easy one if you just want something like kind of crafty to do at home. And it's one that's a really good way to talk about different variables and how you can change up an organism's behavior. So, materials we're using today. I got my yeast, played around with it enough, managed to not toss it on the ground, so that's pretty good. I have a balloon. It's pink because it's me. I've got some sugar, just a little bit. You can tell I bake. I've got water and a peanut butter jar because I didn't want to go to the sink. My kitchen's really dirty, so we're gonna ignore that. And normally for this experiment, I recommend using like a plastic water bottle, but I'm a big fan of tap water, so I had none, but something I do have a lot of because it is pandemic times is a lot of empty bottles of hand sanitizer. So we're gonna use an empty hand sanitizer bottle that's been rinsed clean so I don't instantly kill my yeast. So what we're going to do, first things first, I'm gonna grab a funnel. Funnels are good. Here we go. Got my funnel. So I'm gonna pop my funnel here. We'll do table cam. Pop my funnel on top of my yeast. Put that out of the way because that's electric. I'm gonna pour some water in. This is not an exact science. We're just trying to demonstrate how yeast can do some cool stuff. So I've tossed, like you can see how high the water is. It's not a lot of water. I've tossed some water in there, and now what I'm going to add is I'm going to add some sugar. Because again, we said that yeast like us, love sugar. Everything you eat, anything that's a carb, carbs are just sugars in different combinations. So there's different kinds of sugar. You've got your glucose, fructose, and sucrose. But then any other kinds of carbohydrates are just sugars stuck together in like chains. Kind of if you think of like a beaded necklace, that's a good way to think of it because it's different things all strung together. I just got my homeboy sucrose, good old table sugar with me today. So back to the table. So I'm gonna add like a teaspoon. I'm actually gonna use my half teaspoon because it's gonna be easier to fit in the top. Just scooping it out. Using my giant hands get stuck in the jar. Should I have added this to the funnel first so it wasn't wet and gross? Yes. Did I have forethought? No. So we are rolling with it. I'm gonna add one more half teaspoon. You're at about a teaspoon of sugar. It's a lot for the yeast. You have to imagine the yeast are pretty darn small, so there's not a lot of them bumping around in here. And then I'm gonna add like one heaping half teaspoon of yeast. So, and then I'm going to use a lid for this, but I'm going to shake this bad boy up. The yeast is all mixed together with the water and the sugar, and then I'm going to pop this balloon on top. And we are going to see, this should be a good visual demonstration of how well our friend the yeast is at fermenting. Because this yeast, our yeast in our jar, we're going to check back in that in a little while. The yeast we have in our jar is kind of inert. It's not alive. Well, it's alive. I kind of think of it as it's having a really good nap. So the yeast is just hanging out right now. It's not actively fermenting. It's kind of in stasis. But then it can be sort of reawoken with the help of sugar and water. Just like how I'm woken up in the morning with coffee, yeast likes sugar and water. So, which a lot of my coffee is mostly sugar and water. So, something we're going to be doing for the next couple of weeks, so we're going to be talking about yeast, talking about bread, is I am going to be making sourdough bread from scratch using science. So sourdough bread has recently had a bit of a claim to fame because everyone was in their homes, didn't know what to do with themselves, and thought, hey, this is a good time to compulsively make bread to ignore the fact that the world is on fire. I was amongst them, but I live in the land of mostly gluten-free people, so I don't make a lot of things. I wasn't able to make sourdough bread. But everyone is on vacation in my house except for me, because I'm here with y'all. So we are going to make so much bread. So how does sourdough bread work? Because there's something called a sourdough starter, which is what you normally start your bread with. A lot of places sell them. They're like, oh, I've got artisanal sourdough starter made with yada yada flour, and it's got so much hydration and a bunch of fancy words. You don't need that. You know why? The sourdough bread, the starter, what makes the bread good, what makes the bread airy, what makes the bread rise, is straight up flour and water. That's all it is. All of this like artisanal blah, 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 bogus. You don't need it. I'm a big fan of making your own stuff at home because you know what's going in it, and you're not getting ripped off by fancy names and stuff like that. I'm using regular old whole wheat flour, and I'm using water from my tap that I keep in a peanut butter jar. It's not fancy. So how does that work? Because normally when we make things like quick breads, or if I'm making something like pretzels or whatever, I start with, or focaccia bread, golden, maybe we'll make that later. I start with yeast. I have to add yeast and water together. I have to mix it, and then I add my flour, and then it has to rise, and it has to do all this business. How does the bread rise and turn into bread and not like some hard pancake when I'm not adding yeast? Well, you know how 14 minutes ago I started talking and flailing, and we talked about how yeast lives in a lot of different places? It lives on grain. Yeast can live in the ocean. Yeast has been found in the stomachs of bees. Yeast is found on the surface of fruit. Yeast is found in my skin. Yeast is found in my digestive tract. It's everywhere. It's really hardy. And somewhere where some yeast is right now, is in this bucket of whole wheat flour. Because yeast was living on the grain, hanging out in a field, then it gets harvested and processed. And then just like how yeast hangs out in this jar, kind of inert, it got taken along for a ride with this flour, and flour is just kind of milled, prepped. It's not cooked beforehand. It's not like something pasteurized where you cook it beforehand to kill germs. So the yeast is still hanging out in here, along with lactic acid bacteria. So I'm going to call them lactobacillus in general, or LAB. So yeast is hanging out in here, which we can wake up with our, that we're going to put in a jar so we can wake it up. Then also, this lactic acid bacteria is going to work together. So by adding this water and flour together in a container, I'm using a jar that I sterilized a little earlier. Realize I'm talking near it, so I'm going to hold it over here. I just put some boiling water in it, let it sit for a bit, kill any gunk that's in there. Not super important, but I have a micro degree, so I felt the need to sterilize it. But when I add my flour and water mixture together and let it hang out at room temperature, the yeast and the lactic acid bacteria will kind of wake up, get moving, get grooving, and actually be able to digest the sugar present, locked away in the starch of the flour, and start thriving. So they will reproduce and reproduce and reproduce and make gas and make a little bit of alcohol, but it cooks off in the oven. We're not making booze bread. And also makes lactic acid, which is why sourdough is called sourdough. It's why it's tangy. Just like how I said, yeast produces ethanol as a byproduct, which helps inhibit other gunky bacteria from getting in the way. Lactic acid bacteria does the same thing by producing acid. So that is their way. They produce lactic acid. And I think that's, don't call me on that. It produces this acid to inhibit the growth of other bacteria. But here's the kicker. Lactic acid bacteria are tolerant of ethanol, and yeasts are tolerant of lactic acid. So they actually form like a symbiotic relationship to kill off all of the other microbes in this system, which is why if I add flour and water and let it sit on my counter for 3 days and like turn it into bread, I'm not going to get super sick from some skunky bacteria getting on the scene. It kills off all the other bacteria, and which is why, and by doing this, it produces gas. It acts as the leavener. It's called a levain, technically. And this is how people historically have been able to make bread. Because again, we couldn't buy yeasts. We had to use the natural yeasts in products. So, well, that's starting. Excellent. So, for the next 3 weeks, I am going to be guiding you through making sourdough bread. I have read so many articles. I have read so many recipes. I have read conflicting things. I have read about different parts of making sourdough bread, then read scientific papers on different topics to check to make sure what they're saying is actually true. And I am going to try to scientifically make the best possible sourdough bread by combining a bunch of different recipes. So, what we're going to do is today, I'm going to show you how to make the sourdough starter. We're going to talk a little bit more. I'm going to show you my yeast balloon. And then next week, over the next couple days, I have to feed the starter. Because every day you have to add it a little bit more flour to keep it happy, keep it going so the yeast can reproduce. Because eventually they're going to start using up all of the sugar that's available here. So we have to replenish it every day. I'm going to film that in some chunks. That's going to be posted next week on Canada Day, because technically it's a stat. There won't be a live episode, but you will get to see me every day for a week, feed my little yeasty boy. And then the week after, we are going to make this bread together. So I am going to be making, based on what I read on the internet, I'm going to be starting my sourdough starter with whole wheat flour. I read a lot of conflicting information. Some told me bread flour. Some told me all-purpose. Some told me to use rye flour. And some said whole wheat. The reason I'm using whole wheat is through the logic of what I thought. The reason we are able to make this sourdough bread is because they have natural yeasts and bacteria and stuff in them. So I thought, what flour can I use that's the least processed? And whole wheat flour is the least processed. That's why it's supposed to be better for you, is it has more fiber because it has some of the hull and some of the like the shell of the wheat kernel, which makes it healthier for you because it's not just straight sugar locked in that flour composition. So that is why we're using whole wheat. And then I'm just starting with room temperature water, because you can't tell, but my house is ripping hot right now. So I'm not super worried about starting with warm water. I've seen some sourdough starters where they recommend you starting with sugar I'm not going to do that because it could promote other bacterial growth before the yeast and the lactic acid bacteria have the opportunity to make their inhibitors. So that is why I'm starting it this way. One thing that's apparently important with sourdough bread is hydration. So if you ever see people like after quarantine posting, oh, I made these loaves of sourdough bread and they had 72% hydration and I named it Gerard and I love it so dearly, whatever. That just means how much water are you adding in relation to flour. It's not anything fancier than that. I'm using 50% hydration because I'm going to add a cup of whole wheat flour to my jar and half a cup of water in my jar, stir it around and let it sit on my counter and ferment. It's not anything more fancy than that. Baking, everyone thinks it's fancy. And there's some parts of baking that really are. There are some parts of baking that are complicated, and there's some parts that require a little bit of skill. But at the end of the day, you're adding flour and water together. It's not that complicated. So I'm adding my flour to my jar. I am getting a significant amount on my counter, but that is okay because I have a vacuum cleaner. Yes, I do vacuum my counter instead of sweeping it up. I find it more efficient. So I've got my cup of flour in my jar. Show you, ignore that. I'll show you my, just add some water to this bad boy, and I'm gonna have to go grab a spoon. I'm gonna add half a cup of flour, or half a cup of water, sorry. Delicious. Don't you just want to eat that right away? You don't, because there's still other skunky bacteria in there that haven't been killed off by yeast and by the yeast and the lactic acid bacteria. It's actually why they tell you part of the reason not to eat raw cookie dough, even if it doesn't have eggs in it, is because there can be E. coli in flour. Imagine getting E. coli poisoning from raw flour. It's not a good time. Don't eat raw cookie dough. Bake the flour first. Just pop it in the oven for a little while. Toast it up. Toasting it will make it taste better anyway. So grab a spoon. Actually, I use a fork for mixing. I know mixing spoons make more sense, but I have a bunch of forks, and I find they work better as better like a whisk. So this is getting pretty gluey, but you want to stir it so that no flour bits are dry. Appetizing, I know. It's hot. I am stirring. I'm actually gonna add a titch more water because my flour is pretty dry. This is okay. This is part of baking. Sometimes you're gonna follow my recipe and you're gonna go, this doesn't look right. It does not look like how it did in the picture. That happens to me all the time. It's because we're all in different kitchens. We're all using different stuff. We all measure slightly differently. Measuring cups are not all the same. So sometimes you need to add a little something. So I'm just gonna add like a little, just added like a little splash of water. Just a little more love to stir up. Yeah, that's a little better. Yeah, you can see how gluey and gross it is. And a little more. It's probably more like 60% hydration now, but it's okay. It's not an exact science. Baking is equal parts science and following the recipe and measuring things, and also equal part looking at it and going, that doesn't look quite right, and following your heart. Okay, that is just about good. It's a little bit on the bottom. Isn't this riveting watching me stir gluey flour? That is just about good. So, this bad boy, that's gross. This little yeasty fella, my little jar full of flour yeast, is gonna sit on my counter. I used a jam jar. You wanna use something pretty big because it is gonna rise and you are gonna add flour to it over time. They recommend, all the recipes I recommended, because they're all American, recommended a quart-sized container, which basically is the American way of saying a liter. So I have a big old jam jar. What I'm gonna do is I'm going to just loosely put a tea towel over top so the oxygen can still get in, so there's a little bit of air transfer. You don't want any of your containers to explode from compressed gas. And just loosely leave this. And I'm gonna leave this for the next 24 to 36 hours on a warm countertop. So my house is ripping hot, so I'm not really worried about it not being warm enough because I am actively sweaty. But if you are somewhere else, somewhere it's a little cooler, maybe you have glorious air conditioning. I'm jealous. Warm places to leave it on top of your fridge. Surprisingly, is actually pretty toasty because it is electric. Like there is heat being given off by that. Or on the counter on top of the dishwasher, I find pretty well. But just don't put it in direct sunlight because that can kill off the yeast. You want the yeast to be like happy and healthy. It's just like how I'm not going to say go sit outside in the full sun for 24 hours because you'd get a sunburn. Yeast can be affected by UV and stuff like that too. So leave it on the counter, somewhere warm-ish, loosely covered, and within somewhere between 24 and 36 hours, we should, hopefully, if I did this properly, see some bubble action, which means if we see the bubbles, that means that the yeast and the lactic acid bacteria are producing gas, which means they're alive, which means we are cooking with gas. So, hopefully, I'm going to check on it tomorrow, and every day I feed it and check on it. I'm going to document it with some pictures or a little bit of video. I'll edit it all together and post it next week so that you can kind of see what it looks like before I get started. So you can follow along at home if you want to, or if not, you can just watch me talk to my sourdough starter. The office at Science Venture is currently picking up names, and then there's going to be a vote on Instagram for what we name it. So that is all I have about that sourdough starter. Let's check on this yeast. So it didn't fill up the balloon quite away. I wonder if you can see. You can start seeing bubbles form. That's kind of hard to see, but you can see those bubbles. That is the yeast starting to produce carbon dioxide. And the the balloon actually does have, it's not too much, but because we didn't let it sit for very long. I only want to talk for half an hour because otherwise you're going to get bored of me. But the balloon does have a little bit of pressure. There is some gas being produced, and if I actually push on it, I can feel the resistance against from the bottle. So I'll leave it for a little while, and maybe I'll post that along with our sourdough starter, which we just started. So today we talked about the difference between a eukaryote and a prokaryote. We talked about yeast and symbiotic relationships. Later on, we're going to start talking about things like gluten. We're going to talk about why we prove our bread. We're going to talk about why people put those weird slashes on the top of bread so that's to keep your bread from exploding. We're going to talk about every reason we do different steps when making something like bread. All while learning some kitchen skills together because I think kitchen skills are awesome. They transfer really well to the lab. You learn how to be precise, but you also learn how to problem solve. Baking is great. Cooking is great. And we're only going to be using stuff, once again, that I have in my house. The only piece of maybe finicky equipment that I'm going to be using as we go is I have a kitchen scale. It was $20 on Amazon. We're a lot of experimenting. But everything I do is going to, on all the instructions, which I will post under the video, and they will be updated as we go. Everything I'm going to put in cups, like empirical measurement, American kind of measurement, and I'm going to put it in grams and liters. So that no matter what you have at home, you can do this too. Anyone can make bread. It's awesome, it's easy, and it tastes real darn good. So I won't be seeing you next week because Canada Day. Hope you all have a great Canada Day. But I'll be posting some videos, and I will see you in 2 weeks where we take this bad, gloopy boy and make some bread. Thank you for joining me today for Kitchen Chemistry. My name is Brianna, and I will see you 2 Wednesdays from now. Bye-bye.